coming to another edition of our Author Lunchtime Talks. I'm really glad that you all get to be here to meet Bill Drummond, the author of Prison Truth. I'm going to read his author bio because it's comprehensive. Bill Drummond is professor of journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. His award-winning career involves stints at the Louisville Courier-Journal, where he covered the civil rights movement, and the LA Times, where he was a local reporter, then bureau chief in New Delhi and Jerusalem, and later a Washington correspondent. He was appointed a White House Fellow by then President Gerald R. Ford, and later became Jimmy Carter's Associate Press Secretary. He joined NPR in 1977 and became the founding editor of Morning Edition. At UC Berkeley, Drummond was awarded the 2016 Leon A. Henkin Award for his distinguished service and exceptional commitment to the educational development of students from groups who are underrepresented in the academy. Thank you for coming, Bill.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I should say one other thing about my checkered career in academia. When I first got to UC Berkeley in 1983, I wasn't really sure if this was something that I wanted to do. I got there, I did not have tenure. And they gave me something like 8 years. They said, okay, you got 8 years. When I got there, there had never been anybody who earned tenure. The school was founded, and at the founding of the school, they allowed the dean who created the school to bring in, whoever he wanted, and they said, okay. But then there was this long age gap, and those guys got old, and I was like the first person to come in to kind of replenish the stock. So when I got there, nobody knew whether, a big research university was going to go for this gag that here was a guy whose career had been in publishing newspaper stories, kind of rock'em sock'em newspaper stories, and in doing radio. And I guess you guys are probably more familiar with this than I am, but it's a book culture.
Yeah.
At that time, it was a really confirmed book culture. And from the moment I walked onto the campus, they kept warning me. They said, look, this is the way things stand. You might be a world beater out there in broadcast, but that means nothing to the budget committee. That's what they call it at Berkeley. So man, I was sweating bullets for a long time. But I didn't know how to go about crashing into the book culture, because the only thing I knew how to do was radio documentary. So for like 7.5 years, I was really worried, because I would get these little notices from the dean saying, look, you're running out of time. Where's the book? Jesus. But I got a grant, and I did a radio documentary. It was called Silicon Valley or something. This was like when that whole thing about technology in Santa Clara County was brand new and nobody knew anything about it. So I got a grant from the CPV, and I did like 4 hours, I can't remember, talking to people about what this all meant and the changes and the ethical issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It got a lot of play, and anyway, the deadline came up, and I tried to do a long, interpretive, academic masterpiece that was going to be my centerpiece for my tenure. It was awful. It was terrible. But fortunately, and to my great surprise, they went along with the gag, and they said, okay, we'll give you tenure. And that was the big breakthrough that allowed the journalism school to start bringing in practitioners as tenured faculty, as opposed to lecturers and other things like that. Since then, it's not been a problem. Nobody's raised that, but that was a big breakthrough. Anyway, I got up this morning and rushed into Berkeley and sat in a studio, and I was interviewed for half an hour by a public radio program in Sacramento called Insight, all about this book. So I'm kind of talked out. Every thought I had, broadcast time is much more intense than time in the real world. And I would much prefer to know what's on your mind. I could go on and on talking about my checkered career and telling war stories and stuff like that. But I would much rather know what's on your mind. First of all, question for me, where are the old people? Yeah. No.
Hands raised.
No, that doesn't qualify. I mean, people that know what a clothespin looks like.
What's a clothespin?
That's what we're up against, you know. The people that are into the stuff like newspapers, we were just chatting about this before. The print culture and the book culture and all of that. I don't know. Just because you know, the society that we're in is a youth society, and people get, you know, when you get to be 50, you start looking over your shoulder. I'd be like, you know, I'm afraid to look over my shoulder. I'm the oldest and longest tenured person on the journalism school faculty. I'm the oldest person and longest tenured that has ever been on the journalism school faculty, and there will never be another one. I know that. There'll never be another one. Just because that's the way they change things in universities. They don't give tenure like that anymore. They give you a 3-year contract, and that gives them the flexibility. If your field changes and nobody is interested in that anymore, out you go. And I think a lot gets lost. I keep trying to, and you have to really be careful about this, because when I first got there, I taught people how to do radio, just basic brick and mortar radio, writing for the voice and subject, verb, object, and, you know, always vocalize whatever you write before you put it on the page, because that was the way I was trained. And I taught people to write newspaper stories that were rock'em sock'em, average 14 words a sentence, and, you know, get to the point. 3rd paragraph, who hit Willie? And now, from the time the students show up, we teach them to use equipment. Before they so much as sat in a classroom and talked, we put them through a boot camp in which they learned to put they learned to f-stop cameras, and they learned to look at view meters, and they learned, you know, what software does. And I said, I don't know about this, because when I go in and I say, look, there's something going on, and I want you to cover that story, they start running around and looking for a piece of equipment. I said, no, you don't need that. No, you just go and talk to somebody, and then you come back and tell me what happened. Can't do that. The other thing is, because of the nature of universities, certainly for journalism, and the professionalization of it, we are enrolling more and more people who are not really comfortable talking to people from other social, economic, and ethnic groups. They're, you know, pretty cool talking to their contemporaries and to their colleagues. But no, you send them out on the street and say, you know, what about going down to the BART station and talk to people as they come up and ask them what do they think about Iran? They don't like that. When I was first got to the journalism school, we didn't have all this stuff about equipment, and in the radio training program that I started at the journalism school, we would do that. We would send people down to the BART station. This was before mobile phones. I said, okay, we're going on the air live on the campus station, and I want you to call in from the BART station. I want you to get somebody to come to, and you interview them on the phone. You know, ask them questions on the phone, and they did it. You can't do that now because students freak out. They just don't have that kind of facility in walking up to a stranger. And bringing this all back home to the book, one of the things that is the underlying theme in the book is that I started a class in which I took garden variety UC Berkeley students over to San Quentin. this had never been done before. And I had no idea how it would turn out. And to my astonishment, it worked out amazingly well. There was the, first couple of times they walk down, go through the gate, go down to the lower yard, and you look out at all these guys, and some of them are naked from the waist up, and they're covered with tattoos, and they're doing chin-ups. Not fake chin-ups. No. All of these guys look like they were sent over from central casting. They look like they would kill you for your shoes. So and they're open urinals and toilets. So they think they're never gonna make it out alive. And so we go over into the media center, and they meet these guys, and they're, of course, warmly welcomed. And they strike up conversations, they get relaxed, and pretty soon they become friends. They become friends, and they begin to overcome that barrier, that psychological barrier. And I believe that this is a big breakthrough. A lot of the book is about the benefits of that rehabilitation, etc., all the things that we do brings to the prisoners. But I think the Berkeley students that have gone through this, they wind up so much more capable and empowered. They come out of there and they can, it doesn't faze them. They're talking to people that have done really bad things, but they're not intimidated. And I think that is the saving thing that will bring journalism back. If they can figure out a way to get away from their keyboards and go back out into communities and talk to real people on a one-to-one basis, not with any preconceived notions. And that, it won't be a new technology or a software. It'll be just a commitment that we need to re-engage with people. When I first started in journalism many years ago, my editors did not, in general, have graduate degrees. Many of them did not even have bachelor's degrees. They had learned journalism by working on Stars and Stripes in the military. So there was none of this sort of highfalutin feeling of distance from the audience. People, when we talk about the economy, we're thinking about the stock market. No, a lot of people, to them, the economy is, okay, are we or are we not gonna have meat this week? That's the economy. And people, the economy is holding not 2 jobs, but usually 3. So I think professionalization, right, I make my living selling the idea of professional journalism, but in a way we kind of lost touch. We lost the human touch with people, and it became something that people can't find themselves in it anymore. That's why it's dying. I don't want to sound pessimistic because the evidence is everywhere, and it can't go any worse. It can't get any further gone. I think people realize now that we've got to do something dramatically different. I want to hear from you. What do you guys have to say? Yeah.
So was the motivation to start the paper at San Quentin about, what was the motivation?
Well, the newspaper was started back in 1940.
Oh, okay.
By this legendary warden, Quentin Duffy. And Duffy, it was just his idea that, hey, we need to have some way of combating rumors. It was very, very down to earth. And in those days, the training, the rehabilitation training they had was very industrial. So they said, well, we'll get a printing press.
Yeah.
How bad could that be? And they would train these guys to set type and all that, and that would be valuable, and then eventually they would get out and they could, use that to get a job. So he started it, and it worked out okay. It worked out. It had its limitations. It was very. It was kind of under the control of a clique of prisoners, and
Who controlled the rumors then?
they did a lot. Looking over those old issues, there was a lot of kind of cops and robbers stuff. Somebody was stabbed on the lower yard, you know, stuff like that, and very long and self-indulgent columns that they would write. And this went on for years. Things began to change. This was from 1940, and all through the war and everything. It published, yeah. It's UC Berkeley has got all of the back issues.
Oh, really?
That's one of the projects I've been working on. Find all of the lost issues of San Quentin News, and they've got a pretty complete set now of all of them. And you can just look at corrections down through the ages by reading the pages of the San Quentin News. Anyway, that was the story up until the 1960s. In the 1960s, you can think about it. August 1965, there was the Watts riot. Well, the Watts riot was an outcome of tremendous pressure cooker type racial tensions in California. Well, all of those racial tensions were present on the prison yard. We didn't know about it at the time because the riot took place, you know, in South Central Los Angeles. But all of that stuff was coming up from the streets. Eldridge Cleaver, George Jackson, all these guys were in the jug. So those kinds of racial tensions were a result of criminalization of race. So as a result of that, conflicts began to be very commonplace on the prison yard. That's when I first began to get involved in 1969 and 70 with visiting the prison when I was working for the LA Times. Okay, 1970, a kid named Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson's brother, who's like a teenager, he tries to break his brother out of San Quentin. It was a big shootout at the San Rafael Civic Center. A bunch of people got killed, including Jonathan. Okay, at that point, all of a sudden people began to recognize that they had a problem. Well, all of that spilled into the newspaper. The newspaper, they wouldn't let them publish anything at all about those incidents. They couldn't do it. So there was a big struggle. The wardens didn't want to inflame things any worse than they were. And the iconic Johnny Cash 1969 concert, which I write a lot about in the book, is horrific because if you listen to that album and Johnny Cash sings this song, and after every refrain you hear all these guys saying, yeah, 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 everybody's saying, oh boy, you know, they're really enjoying themselves. No, this place is about to blow up. And Johnny Cash told his biographer that he felt that all he had to do was say, okay, this is it. And it would have been Armageddon, but he didn't do it. Anyway, to make a long story short, all the way through the 70s and through much of the 80s, there was this unbelievable racial tension and violence. And the San Quentin News, under a succession of editors, prison editors, they decided that they were going to do some oppositional stories, and they were going to try to publish investigative pieces. And the warden and the CDC were not having it, and so they shut it down. And it stayed dark with sporadic other issues, maybe half a dozen, for the next 20 years. And it wasn't until 2008 that a warden came along and he said, hey, we need a newspaper. And they revived it, 2008, and it started in a very modest level. Almost immediately, this is part of the struggle of San Quentin News, at that point, the state decided that that printing plant was obsolete and nobody was doing printing anymore. So they ended the subsidy of publishing the newspaper because they said, we're no longer going to train people to be printers. Wow. Well, that's when these handful of well-meaning people from San Rafael, civilians, got involved, and they raised money, and they were able to get private foundations to back them, and they were able to raise enough money in order to publish the newspaper, actually print the newspaper at a printing plant in San Rafael. And that's the way it's been going ever since. It's been running off of foundation grants. They have foundation grants from the Logan's Foundation, Ford Foundation, whatever. So it's really still a hand-to-mouth operation, but thanks to God, from 2008 it's still going on.
And did they reach out to you in 2008, or you had an ongoing relationship?
Well, this is part of the kind of zigzag part of my life, my career. All of the bad things that were happening in journalism made a big impression on me. I don't want to give you the wrong idea. I really enjoy teaching, but I also have a hard time walking into a classroom and trying to explain to these kids. It's like, hey, explain to your children that they're not going to have as good a life as you did. That's a difficult conversation. Well, it kind of like, it never happened. I never even thought of that up and through, say, like 2006. I was watching people have great careers. They were doing fantastic stuff. Along about 2006 or so, I started wondering, wait a minute, something's not right here. So it became more and more difficult for me, and I kept saying, well, why am I in despair, and why am I losing my enthusiasm for doing this? And just by accident, one of my former students, his name is Nigel Hatton. Nigel had been a student back in the 90s, and Nigel was no fool. He went back to college and got his PhD. And Nigel is on the faculty now at UC Merced. Well, Nigel got in touch with me and asked if I was interested in co-teaching a class with him at San Quentin under a thing called the Prison University Project. Yeah. And it was the summer of 2012. I didn't have anything going. So I agreed. And as it turned out, Nigel got a grant to go to Copenhagen, and he kind of like absconded and left me in charge of this class. And I had 15 students and 4 auditors. All of these guys, like I was saying before, they were hard cases. It's not like, sitting in a freshman seminar with a bunch of Berkeley kids. These guys looked the role of prisoners. So that was kind of intimidating. But once I got to know them and I started giving them assignments, attendance was always 100%. There was never any question. They talked a lot, we shared a lot of ideas. I gave them some standard assignments that I've been giving for years to UC students. Like I asked them to write their own obituaries. And this wigged them out, absolutely, because they'd never contemplated their own death. It was interesting, the outcome, that's one of my most remarkable outcomes. Maybe I would do a book about prison obituaries written by people who are still alive. And they almost always portrayed themselves as some sort of heroic figure. And if they died, it was an unbelievable heroic death. They did it saving some prison staff person or some other heroic deed. Well, yeah, but it showed me that they had aspirations for being different. They wanted to be different. They wanted a different life. So we had lots of laughs, and they, like I said in the book over and over, I learned more from them than they ever learned from me. One guy wrote a story, it's funny, he worked in the I asked him, I said, go around, find an interesting person in your cell block, and interview that person, do a profile. One guy did a profile of another inmate who worked in what's called the Prison Industries Authority. It's like a giant workshop, and under contract with the state, they manufacture furniture for different things like state hospitals and things like that, bedding and all that, but otherwise they would have to buy. And my suspicion is that they're also making furniture that goes into a lot of the dorms in the UC system. I asked one friend of mine who was a vice chancellor, I said, are you guys using prison labor to furnish the dorms? And he swears that they weren't, but I don't believe him. But anyway, this particular prisoner was working in the furniture building side, and they make sofas, kind of like that. So he had this brilliant idea for escaping. And what he did, he managed to linger around one day after work when nobody was watching. And they put all of these sofas that they built into a big carton. So he somehow secreted himself into that couch so he couldn't be seen. And so the couch went into the carton, and then the next day it went into a trunk. It went on the back of a truck, which then pulled out of the prison, went across the bridge and headed for Highway 5. And he said he rode in there for God knows how many hours, like 12, 15 hours. And finally the thing came to a stop. And he figured he had to get out of there, otherwise he was gonna die. So he claws his way out of this carton and manages to, and he's still in his prison blues, right? He manages to get himself out of the truck onto a street, which is down in Tulare County somewhere, and walks away from the truck. And he said some kid saw him and was pointing it out to his mom, and the mom figured that, oh, this is a worker or something. He's unloading the truck. The guy stayed on the run for like a year and a half. He eventually was found, brought back. I thought that's a hell of a story. That's a movie. All of these things, everything they write is, you kind of say, hey, that's a movie. That's a movie. Anyway, I digress. After 15 weeks of hanging around with these guys and reading their copy and exchanging lies, I think most of them they were telling me were lies, but they were enjoyable lies.
That's the title.
Enjoyable lies. So when the last day, literally the last day that we met, and I said, okay, thanks a lot, guys. One of my students in that class was a guy named Juan Haynes. Juan is a bank robber from San Diego County. He never killed anybody. Juan approached me and he said, we're publishing this newspaper, and would you like to participate, to help us and support us? Why? I'm flattered, but I don't know how I could help, but sure, I'm open to suggestions. And that's when I met Arnulfo García, who was serving 4 life sentences. See, how do people get 4 life sentences when they never killed anybody? That's a long story, you have to read the book. But Arnulfo was the editor-in-chief, and he's a very charming guy, and he was the one that kind of officially brought me in and introduced me around, and I met the civilian advisors, and they were very warm and welcoming. And I said, this is a good idea. Now, how can I help? They had visions that I would come over and help hook paragraphs and edit copy. And I said, yeah, I could do that, but that's kind of limited. What's really happening at the journalism school is that we don't do editing anymore. For the last 6 years, we jettisoned our basic class in editing. I'm not kidding you.
And it shows.
We don't Kids don't know the difference between that and which. So I said, well, it would be helpful if I brought UC students over and they sat with you and give them the AP style book and say, okay, you read this person's copy. And you may not be a professional, but you know more than they do because they're 10th grade education. And so I started off modestly with I think about 5 or 6 students. And little by little, more people got interested as this whole idea of incarceration became more of a issue of public discussion. And now it's very popular. Everybody wants to do it. And once they start doing it, they don't want to leave. Even after they graduate, they keep coming. And along the way, San Quentin News is much bigger. It now publishes a magazine called Wall City. And it also publishes pages in Spanish. And I have the help and support of a wonderful, wonderful woman at San Francisco State named Ana Cardenas. She's a professor of journalism at San Francisco State and bilingual. And she works with the half a dozen or so Spanish language writers. We're trying to get the same kind of deal going with somebody who speaks Vietnamese. That's hard. That's really hard. I've been scanning, and harassing people on the UC campus, and so far I have not been successful. But if you have any contacts, hey, please let me know. Somebody fluent in Vietnamese who wants to contribute. That's the next big step. They've also got video equipment. They want to do video. They have audio equipment. They want to do audio. Got a website. They're tweeting. So the students who come over now are doing more than just hooking paragraphs. A lot of them are involved with the multimedia stuff and with the things on the web. So what does the future look like? It's amazing how the pendulum is swung. The biggest proponent of kind of openness in the prison system now is the CDCR itself. I point out in the book the irony that a guy who was a producer in public radio is now the guy that's running the PR operation for the CDCR, Jeff Callison, who's from Scotland, so he has a whole different mindset about this. And if you look at the CDCR website, they're publishing nothing but positive stories about people doing wonderful things and being successful. In the past, not so distant past, the CDCR's information campaign was basically to deny. When they did something bad or somebody escaped, they would give you the minimal amount of information. Now those guys are showing up and they're putting video on Facebook and every place else, to try to show that, look, we're helping. We want these people to go back and be welcomed in society. We don't want to become the warehouse of society's failures. To me, this is a huge change in the mentality of people in California and the things that they're doing compared to even like 20 years ago, compared to every other state.
Is CDCR still the largest employer in California?
Is it the largest employer?
Yeah, I've heard that fact. I don't know if it's true.
I heard the other day it was UC.
If you consider
That was
inmates to be employees, that's probably true, because there are 160,000 inmates. That's a lot of folks. The budget bite is unbelievable. It's larger than the state spends on education. It's like $7.9 billion, and that didn't used to be the case, but now you're stuck with it. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm curious how the history of the paper at San Quentin compared to publications at other jails, other prisons across the country, because I know some other ones have or have had programs too.
There's the only one that has the same longevity and is still going today is the Angolite at Angola.
Yeah.
and that history is really, really bizarre and peculiar. They do a wonderful job, and Wilbert Rideow, who's the legendary editor, who's still on the planet, great guy, he was instrumental in helping to revive San Quentin's newspaper. But Rideow, he was good to go. He was on death row, and he managed eventually to be released, and now he's in the free world. But he's established it. It's got money. It's got credibility. That's the only one in this country that I know about. Certainly in this state, and I've researched this back and forward. There are no other newspapers that we would call a newspaper operating in this state, with about 3 exceptions. One, they just began last January a newspaper in a prison, a Mule Creek State Prison, which is up in the Sierra, which is funded incidentally by the Miwok Indian tribe. Don't ask me, but they do it. The Miwoks, they have casino interests and businesses and everything. They say, hey, we need a newspaper in that prison. So that's what they've been doing. The other one is a newsletter that comes out of Solano State Prison. It's very sporadic. I mentioned that in the book. And then I just learned, I guess 2 weeks ago, that there's a podcast that's being produced at Pelican Bay. And all of this, none of this would have happened. There would have been no ear hustle if it hadn't been for San Quentin News, because they were the ones that were able to push the possibilities. And so far, they've not been any great blunders. There've been clashes, and sometimes, the newspapers have been suspended, but they haven't done anything so disastrous that they were going to be shut down.
My question actually had to do with ear hustle. I was wondering how your background in radio journalism informs your opinion of that podcast and what it does well and maybe not so well. I don't know what you think about that.
My background in radio came very late in my life. I had been in journalism for 15 years, off and on, accounting for my year in government, before I ever went into radio. And radio informed my journalism. It was like a wonderful revelation, because it reunited writing with speaking. And when I was trained to actually produce for radio, it was like learning journalism all over again. And it's the lesson I always learn. I guess it's automatic now in my brain, but I still read things aloud. I read things aloud. And if it doesn't work, if I can't say it, if I run out of breath, no, you got to start over. So that is something that informed my teaching when I was at UC Berkeley. Now, you got to kind of like be realistic when you start dealing with the prison environment. First of all, these guys, for the most part, have 9th grade education. If you're lucky, then they get a GED. And so you're going back to basics. It doesn't mean that they're not intelligent. It doesn't mean that they aren't extraordinarily verbal. Now, what you got to do is change that, turn that into something that can be publishable. And that's a struggle. And they don't have, this is another thing about journalism. Journalism is basically, it's very simple. We in order to be located on a university campus, we kind of like over intellectualize it. No, it's basically saying, who hit Willie? But if you say that to the budget committee, they say, we're not gonna hire people that go around telling folks who hit Willie. So you glorify it. No, it's basically who hit Willie, and that's something that's very easy to describe. The problem with prisoners is that they don't have any self-confidence. They don't know how to summarize. So if you give them a complex story, what they want to do is they want to just take big blocks of type and put it in there. I said, no, tell me in your own words what happened. And that's where you run into problems. And that's no different from the Berkeley students, but they don't have confidence, and also they don't have Google, so they can't, get the full, story. When you sit down with a prisoner to edit with them, they come with a loose leaf binder, and they've got all of these documents because they don't want to make a mistake. My radio training, though, it helps in the sense that I'm trying to get them to step away from the printed page of all of their reference material. Now tell me in your own words. Tell me in your own words what happened. And they usually can do that. You say, well, you don't need to go into that amount of detail, just in the general way, what is going on here? And then you put in a couple of good quotes here, and then that's the ball game. That's as much as we need to know. This is not an encyclopedia. And they tend to get that. Now, one of the things that's happened is that we've gone beyond just publishing a newspaper. Now we're involved in all of this social media stuff. So it's similar to what's happening at the journalism school. A lot of them, they find this tedious. They find writing for print tedious. Hey, just turn me loose with the microphone and the camera. I don't know about that, because I want to know what the story is before you start, setting up and opening the tripods and just showing me video. Why am I watching that? Why am I here? That's a much more difficult thing. But it's not unique to prisoners. It's unique to anybody that now has all of these technological tools, because it in my opinion, it gives you the illusion that you know something, but you don't. All you know is you watch something. Why was I watching that? What happened? Who hit Willie? Yeah.
I'm curious, you haven't really spoken about what editorial filters there are on the content. Like, I imagine they don't have full First Amendment rights, or maybe they do, I don't know. Like, what are the limitations on?
Legally, prisoners have full First Amendment rights. This was established years ago in a landmark Supreme Court case. It didn't involve newspapers, and it was subject to wide interpretation and misinterpretation. The case actually, it was Martinez v. Procunier, I believe, and it basically involved correspondence between an inmate and his lawyer. And the decision came down that the state could not interfere with that unless that correspondence had something to do with the safety and security or legitimate operation of the prison. That's as much as it said. Well, that's been widely interpreted to mean that that they can publish. Well, no, not exactly. But the courts, particularly in California, have ruled that they can publish. You can't stop them from publishing unless what they publish has a bearing on the safety and security of that prison or the legitimate operations of the prison. So the courts have put the prison system on notice. You can't fool around with that. But it doesn't say that you have to run the newspaper. So what happened in the 1980s was that they faced like a succession of different state courts in California saying, you can't stop that. One celebrated case involved an investigative story they did about the mess hall at San Quentin that had broken windows and all that stuff. And the newspaper published a story saying that there was bird droppings in the mess hall, and the warden stopped publication and confiscated all the copies. So they sued, and the judge says, no, you can't stop that because this looks like journalism to me. Well, then the state said, well, okay, in that case we don't need a newspaper, do we? So that was the end of that. So the short answer to your question, yeah, you can do that. but you can publish gotcha stories or investigative pieces, and they can shut you down. And if they shut you down, you're out of business. So it's not unlike journalism in Czechoslovakia before 1989. You know, it's guided democracy. But within that narrow framework of what they're allowed to publish, they found a wide area for maneuver of stories that are not told and are useful and can be supported and are sustainable. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any access to get their stories out at all. Because they've in the recent past, they've shut down and confiscated copies of the newspaper for trivial things, not big things. But in the end, there's nothing you can do. And it's just kind of a warning that, look, you really have to be careful. And so there are all sorts of filters. Every word that they write is reviewed by the management. It's reviewed in Sacramento. They've got some poor wretch in Sacramento whose job is to read everything in the paper. The agreement that they have is that if they decide that some story is unacceptable, then the grounds for their objection is then used as a statement from the CDCR that's inserted in that story. Do you follow me? Say they do a story that says, you know, something about the death penalty, and they don't, all this stuff about the drugs and, which drugs are used, and say there's a quote from some advocate person saying this is cruel and inhuman, and then it goes to Sacramento, and then they say, we don't agree with that. Say, fine, give us a statement as to why you don't agree with that, and we'll insert that after this quote. So it changed everything, because all of a sudden the stories that they published became authoritative because they involved an actual scrutiny by the management, and they allowed it to be published, then you're off the hook.
Is there anything in place to ensure future collaboration between the Berkeley Department of Journalism and San Quentin News when you finally decide to,
When I give it up?
Yeah.
At the moment, I would say no. There are some people that have worked with me there who've moved on to elsewhere and they're developing programs at other places. There's a woman who had been on the J School faculty, and she's moved on to Medill, and she's still very much involved in San Quentin News whenever she visits out here. But she's trying to get something generated, and God knows in Chicago and Illinois they could use it. There's another woman, Shaheen Pasha, who's a professor at Penn State, and Shaheen is also gung-ho for using her San Quentin News experience and San Quentin model for generating something in Pennsylvania. Those are the ones that I know about. There could be others, I'm just not aware of it. But it's a sort of thing. We have a very small faculty. I think they're not more than 12 FTEs on our whole faculty, and each person has a certain portfolio that they carry. And at the moment, there's nobody else that is interested in doing this that I know of. But if I should, retire or go into assisted living, I would be shocked and amazed that somebody else on the campus, maybe not in the journalism school. I should say the Prison University Project, which has been in existence now for about 20 years, they draw a huge amount of support from not just Berkeley, but from all the campuses in the Bay Area. And they offer college level courses to the people in the prison. And I would be astonished if somebody else didn't pick this up and run with it.
We have time for one more question. Anybody?
Bill, I have a question for you.
Okay. Disembodied voice.
So you describe in really harrowing detail witnessing the murder of your mom as a kid. And so that would seem on the surface to a lot of readers to make you an unlikely ally to a lot of these guys. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your journey to empathy and reconciliation growing up and through your work at the paper, and what lessons we might all draw about viewing the potential of those in prison who have committed the most atrocious crimes.
Yeah, happy to. You know that in a very few words, I discovered restorative justice before it had actually happened. Now, restorative justice is almost like a cliche. It's a means of reconciling with somebody that has done something terrible to you. It's Sharia law is what it is. It's one of the basic tenets of Sharia. If you kill somebody under Sharia law, they turn you over to the family. And if you can work out a deal, fine. If not, you suffer the consequences. But when I was a kid, my mother was murdered by her lover, and I was 12 years old. And I, at that time, you know, being a kid, I was devastated, and I wanted it to be over. But as time passed, you know, I had all of these lingering questions about what happened to the perpetrator. I knew he had gone to prison, and at that time, there were only 8 prisons in the system, so I knew he was at San Quentin. So when I made my first trip there in 1970, I fully expected that I might walk up on him. And I had to kind of ask myself, well, what are you going to do if this happens? And in a way, I had to be realistic that I couldn't harbor any kind of hateful feelings of hatred toward him, because he was in love with my mother. He did something impulsive and he killed her. So I kind of backed away from allowing that loss to consume me. And I attempted during my first visit there to actually find out what had happened to him. I was unsuccessful. But when I walked away, I didn't feel as though, I felt as though I had closed the door on that, because I had, you know, approached my worst fear and I had walked away from it. I had done due diligence, couldn't do any more. So I went ahead and I had a life. Well, in a way, that was kind of like do-it-yourself restorative justice. And when I have been at San Quentin and I have interacted with people who have committed murder, I have felt as though I had empathy. And I spoke about this before. There was, this was about 3 or 4 months ago, one of the Latinos, a guy named Tare, is going to the board, and he asked me if I would help him write his statement. Each inmate who goes before the board has to write a statement to the board that shows insight into his crime. It's like a cliche. Do you have insight into crime? And I said, fine, I'll happy to help. So one evening, one Sunday, he showed me his statement, and I said, wow. He's describing a murder, and it's as though he's a fly on the wall. You know, he's not even there. He's like watching this unfold, and he's not a participant. So I began to ask him. I said, oh, okay. So who was this person? He said, it was my girlfriend. Ah, okay. And how did you kill her? And he starts doing these stabbing motions. I said, okay. So you stabbed your girlfriend to death. Yeah. All right. And did she have kids? Yes, she had 2 kids. I said, so you're telling me you stabbed her to death and you left her children to fend for themselves? Yes. I said, okay. And were you high at the time? Yeah, I had been drinking. I said, okay, let's back up now. You have to acknowledge that. You have to tell me that that's what you did. It just didn't happen. You weren't just responsible for her death. You did it. That belongs in the statement. He didn't object. I think I kind of helped him along the way. A lot of times, and I've said this before, the reason that, and if you didn't know this, it's true, the murderers have the lowest recidivism rate of any people in prison. The ones that are the hardest, alcoholic check writers. No, they're hopeless. Murderers, the moment they commit the murder, for most people, their rehabilitation has occurred. And they deny it. They keep trying to fight it off. I was not there. I didn't do it. I was responsible, but I wasn't. No. When they acknowledge that that's what they did, that is when they begin to become a human being. They resolve this for themselves. And Tare, I think, I may have been the first person to force him to do that. I don't know. He's been in the jug for 20 years. I don't know if anybody else just had him do that, because they have rehab programs, and you come in, everybody sits in a circle and say, hi, I'm Bill, and I'm from Alameda County, blah, 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 blah. But they aren't really coming in a personal way to reconcile with what they actually did. But for me, I was able to do that because I had been there, and I know what it's like, when somebody dies, when somebody is murdered. I don't think many people have that.
Thank you so much for coming, Bill. This has really been an incredible talk.
Oh, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you.
And congratulations on the publication of your book.
I couldn't have done it without you.